Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our IGE forum. Today, I'm so very excited to have an outstanding guest speaker, Mr. David Dalla, a world's leading expert on China's economy and US-China relations. He will be joining us live from Washington, DC, to discuss very important and timely issues about the challenges facing China nowadays, their implications for US-China relations, global economy, and South Korea. Mr. Dalla is currently a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. From 2009 to 2013, he was US Treasury's economic and financial emissary to China, based in Beijing, facilitating the macroeconomic and financial dialogue between the United States and China. Prior to joining the Treasury, David worked for 20 years at the World Bank, serving as country director for China, and his other World Bank assignments focused on Asian economies, including Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh, and India. He also taught at UCLA. He has a doctorate in economics from NYU, a bachelor's in Chinese history and language from Dartmouth College. Personally, I might add, David is a good and respected friend of mine since our old days at World Bank many years ago. Without further ado, let's welcome David, who will speak for about 20 minutes first, followed by Q&As until about 11 a.m. In Seoul time as scheduled. David, great to see you, and welcome to Korea, even virtually today. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Kwang-woo. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I wish I could be in Seoul in person, and hopefully we'll get back to that kind of international travel before too long. But for the moment, I'm very pleased to be able to join virtually. I'm going to talk about what's happening in the Chinese economy and a little bit about US-China relations. And I'm going to emphasize that it's very unusual patterns that we see in the Chinese economy right now. It's not a normal recovery from recession. It's quite unusual. And I'm going to emphasize that I think some aspects of what's happening are temporary or transitory, and China can manage them. But at least one issue I think is pretty serious and more long-term. So I want to make 3 points. First, I'm going to talk about some headwinds that I think are mostly self-generated by China, and what that effect is and what needs to be done. And then I'm going to talk about real estate, property development. I think that's the area where, China really has longer term problems that it needs to address. And then third, I'm going to talk about trade. Trade is actually an extremely positive story for China, South Korea, other Asian economies in 2021. So let me start with some of the headwinds. At the beginning of 2021, it seemed that China was bouncing back very quickly from the recession caused by the COVID pandemic. In the first half of the year, China grew at 12.7% in real terms, which is a very strong bounce back. But since then, I think it has some self-inflicted problems. It's generated an energy crisis. In some ways, the crisis starts with that strong bounce back in the first half of the year. Energy demand went up very quickly, which is happening all over the world. China also had stopped importing coal from Australia for political reasons, plus some of China's own coal mines were flooded or closed down for environmental reasons. So there was a shortage of coal and energy, and there was a big increase in demand, and you get the predictable result of prices going up very dramatically, prices in particular for coal and natural gas. But China also controls the price of power at a pretty low level, so it became unprofitable to generate power, and quite a few power companies just shut down their coal-fired plants. So you really had some pretty serious shortages, and I think that now China is easing up on the price controls, and this is a problem that they caused themselves, and they can undo the damage with the right policies. And I think that energy problem is already starting to ease up. Now, another thing that is really self-inflicted is they've had this consistent crackdown on digital economy firms. I think it's been a succession of firms, starting with Ant Financial, the online payments firm, also Didi, the ride-sharing company, Meituan food delivery, and then the online tutoring. And it may seem like China's going after all the big private firms, but I don't think it's a general crackdown on the private sector. I think it's very targeted at digital economy firms. The top leadership is worried these firms are getting too big, too powerful, too much control over data. And I think some of the regulatory moves are actually quite sensible and similar to some things that are happening in the US and Europe. But the regulatory moves were made, fairly abruptly. And I think that has caused some concern. But I don't see it as a general crackdown on the private sector. And more recently, you've got top leaders like Li Keqiang or Liu He who've talked about the important role of the private sector, particularly small and medium enterprises. But certainly for a while, the atmosphere for private sector development definitely cooled down, and that was another factor. And then you have this ongoing zero tolerance policy. If any of us tried to go to China, we'd have to quarantine for 2 to 3 weeks, which is pretty high burden to put on international travelers. Any little outbreak in China of the COVID-19, then we get a very strong crackdown. People kept at home and tested every day. And China's been pretty successful at not having a mass spread of the disease, but this approach does take its toll on the economy. So these are all some immediate headwinds, and the impact of this is that in this third quarter, China's economy slowed down very dramatically. After growing 12.7% in the first half of the year, in the third quarter, it was growing at less than 1% on a quarter-to-quarter basis. The growth was 4.9% compared to a year ago, but it was only less than 1% annualized between the second quarter and the third quarter. So that's a very dramatic slowdown. And I think a good statistic that summarizes this unusual situation in the Chinese economy is the data they just announced on producer prices versus consumer prices. Producer price inflation was the highest ever recorded in China. They just reported 13.5% producer price inflation compared to a year ago. Consumer price inflation is only 1.5%. So that's a remarkable difference. And I think it reflects that consumption, a lot of consumption is services. That whole part of the economy is still pretty soft. People have not returned to their pre-COVID lifestyle. On the other hand, you've got the energy shortage, and I'll come to some other parts of the economy in industry that are booming pretty well. And so you've got kind of very hot economy in some sectors and a very cold economy in other sectors. And that's one of the things that's unusual. Now, the second issue I want to take up is another important headwind, but I'm keeping it separate because I think it doesn't have such an immediate, simple solution as the other issues do. And that's property development. I think we've seen, excessive expansion of housing construction and property development. And, there's some very large private firms. Hongda is one of them. There are quite a few others. Aside from property development, Hongda had spread into other lines of business like electric vehicles and banking. And in general, conglomerates that have a lot of different business lines, that's usually not a very efficient organizational form. And Hongda has certainly gotten into trouble, having difficulty meeting its enormous debt obligations. It owes $300 billion US. But the current situation has also been precipitated by strengthening of government regulation. About a year ago, China came in with the 3 red lines. Important thing to take away is that this was aimed at tightening up the regulations of real estate development to prevent firms from being overly leveraged, and in particular, not to use short-term finance for property development. And this tightening has revealed the weakness in Hongda and a number of other property developers. They're starting to miss payments on international bonds. I do not think the government is going to bail out this whole sector. I think it would be a mistake for the government to bail out the whole sector because some of the problems are from overexpansion by these firms, and there is a moral hazard problem. If the government bails out private firms that start to go bankrupt, then you really lose all of the discipline of the marketplace, basically. So I suspect that some real estate developers will end up going bankrupt, and what the government is going to concentrate on is avoiding contagion, in the sense of if some firms can't survive, you don't want their weaknesses to spill over and hurt firms that are fundamentally sound. So you want the banks to continue to lend into the real estate sector and distinguish between the good firms and the bad firms. Not easy to do, but very important to get that right, because otherwise you could have a drying up of credit to the whole real estate sector. Now, I do think China has some tools. It's told its banks to keep lending to real estate, and it's quietly easing up on financial conditions. So I think we're about to see a turn in the credit cycle in China to become more accommodative and prevent the problems of a few developers from turning into any kind of larger financial crisis in China. That's certainly the risk. I think they can avoid a large financial crisis. I don't think this is the so-called Lehman moment for a variety of reasons. But cleaning up the problems in real estate is not going to be done very quickly, not overnight. They have overbuilt the housing stock. There are too many apartments, many of them in the wrong places. So we see apartment prices starting to fall. We could very well be into a period, where there's, first decline and then prolonged softness in apartment prices in China. The government's talking about instituting a property tax, which is a very sensible public finance measure. They need to finance retirement and different types of social programs. But as it becomes clear that apartment prices are not going to keep going up, and there's a tax, meaning there's a cost to holding them, you will probably see some significant part of Chinese household wealth shift out of apartments, out of real estate into other assets. And this is something China needs in the longer run. Households have about 75% of their wealth in apartments. That doesn't really make sense. China is developing different stock markets. It's got a large bond market. There are other investment opportunities. So households need to diversify away from real estate, but starting from where they are, this is going to be somewhat painful. And I think the important point for our discussion is, very aggressive real estate development has been a key part of China's growth since the global financial crisis about 12, 13 years ago. That's probably now over, and there will not be construction activity at the same level. It will not contribute to growth in the same way. And, it's probably one important reason why China's overall growth rate is likely to be slowing down. I mentioned right now things are quite bad because of cyclical reasons. China will recover from that, but it's probably going to be growing in the 4 to 5% range as we look out to the medium term. And real estate is not going to provide the same kind of kick that it has in the past. Now, the third issue I want to take up is international trade. Trade is actually a very bright spot in China's development right now. It's quite remarkable to observe. I think there's large worldwide demand for the manufacturers that China produces. So I'm not sure about in Korea, but in America, I can tell you, we're working from home. We're entertaining ourselves at home. So a lot of Americans have ordered more electronic equipment, new laptops, maybe exercise equipment, giant screen TVs, since we don't go out to the movies anymore. The demand for those huge TVs in America went up 77% in 1 year, which is a very unusual situation. So China's trade in general is booming. They just reported another month with about 28% rate of growth of exports compared to a year ago. Their imports are pretty robust, but they do have a large and growing trade surplus. The most recent month was $85 billion. So they seem to be heading toward about $1 trillion surplus. That might create some problems with their trading partners. Right now, the trade situation with the US is complicated. The trade volume between China and the US will hit a new historic high this year, and the trade deficit from the US side will probably hit a new high, both the overall deficit and the deficit with China. It doesn't seem to be so much of a political issue right now. We're facing some moderate inflation in the US. Importing these products meets demand and keeps inflation from being higher than it would be. So it doesn't seem to be an issue right at the moment. But the US has kept these tariffs aimed at China. We still have 25% tariff aimed at about half of what we were importing from China. And so it's quite remarkable that that does not seem to have had much effect. As I said, we're going to hit a new historic high in trade, partly because the tariff is not aimed at some of the most popular products like laptop computers and tablets. But in other cases, American consumers are just paying the import tax, and it hasn't had too much effect on demand. There's been a little bit of retooling of value chains, so certain products that are hit with the tariff, final assembly is shifted from China to Vietnam, but there's really not evidence that that's very large. As I said, we will be importing a historic high amount of imports from China this year. So that, that's really the bottom line figure. I see that China-Korea trade is still very strong. The biggest item traded back and forth is different types of integrated circuits and semiconductors. There's been a worldwide shortage, so anyone who's producing semiconductors is in a strong position. And I'm impressed that Korea's economy is growing at 4.3% this year with only 2.2% inflation. You seem to have avoided the big inflation that we're facing in the US and many other advanced economies are facing. Now, President Biden and President Xi are going to meet next week. I think they announced it'll be Monday. This will be a virtual meeting. There's frankly not been a lot of preparation, so don't have high expectations for any real outcomes in the sense of measures. I don't see there's any chance the US would change its trade policy toward China. But there has been growing tension between the two, and a good meeting should diffuse some of the tension. The US has made a number of careless statements about Taiwan, and hopefully President Biden will have a nice private conversation with President Xi, and it's in everyone's interest not to have a military conflict between the US and China. I think that's obvious. To me, that's the most important issue in the talks, is to just clarify the situation around Taiwan and the military situation in the East China Sea, the South China Sea. Perhaps they'll announce some kind of new economic dialogue. That would be positive. As I said, I don't expect any actual measures in the sense of the US taking away its tariffs, but they might announce economic talks between Liu He and his counterparts on the US side. But I have to say, I'm not too optimistic, even if they're talks. I think the politics in both countries make it difficult for the US and China to, really put the trade war to bed. There's a lot of hostility toward China in the US Congress, both political parties. President Xi is obviously positioning himself to get another 5-year term at the party Congress at the end of 2022. So I can't see US or China making any visible compromise in the next year. So probably the formal trade situation between the two will stay the same. But I come back to the point I made that despite what looks like a trade war on paper, the actual trade is at an all-time high, and US investment into China also continues at a very high level. So it's an unusual kind of trade war. I don't want to downplay the issues too much. American firms are concerned about the uncertainty that it all creates, but for the moment, trade is actually occurring at a high level. So let me just briefly wrap up that it's an unusual situation where trade, as I said, is booming. And that's one of the things pushing up demand in China, pushing up production, I should say, in China, and pushing up the prices we see in the producer price index. But meanwhile, consumption is very growing slowly because people are still spending a lot of time at home and not returning to their normal lives. China's got an energy crisis that it created itself that it can undo. It's got some immediate problems that it caused itself, and it can change those policies and get back on track. But I do think the real estate will take a few years for that really to get worked out. And that's likely to take something off China's growth rate, as we look out over what we call the medium term, say next 3 to 5 years. But where all that leads to is, we're not going to be seeing 8% growth in China anymore, probably not even 6 or 7. But if China can grow consistently at 5%, say, it will still be the biggest market in the world within a few years. still going to be an important driver of global economic growth. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for your brilliant opening presentation. Now, we'd like to proceed with the discussion on some topical issues with you. Continuing our tradition to invite a very distinguished guest as a special commentator, if you like. I'm so very pleased to have Mr. Sung Gi-hak, Chairman and CEO of the Youngwon Group. As you know, Chairman Sung is one of the most respected business leaders in Korea and abroad, and also widely recognized for his generous philanthropic efforts around the world. He's on the board of directors at my institute, IGE, as well as serving as a member of the directors, member of the International Advisory Council at your Brookings institution. So let's welcome Chairman Sung for his perspectives on today's topic. Chairman Sung, floor is yours.
Good evening, Dr. David Dollar. I miss Brookings gatherings so far last 2 years, and I wish I could go back to DC, for the meeting. And then also I want to discuss things further with you in person about the China issues here. This is I see this trade perspective. You have a very good feeling about the increasing trades, etc. But recently, Korea is suffering a lot because of the export, restriction or stoppage of indispensable, items like urea solution. Urea solution is required for, in reducing this pollution of diesel cars and the diesel engines. So whole Korea is now suffering because of lack of this one. China stopped, and I believe that this kind of, retaliatory, I don't know for what they are retaliating, measures will be taking place more often than it was before, knowing that it can shake the other partners very, very seriously and severely. So with this kind of retaliation or stoppage of export of such a item, which is reliant on China, I think China will know, and then they will do more. Like they found out that Australian coal was very indispensable for them. How do you see that with this considered, how do you see the world trade could really go on smoothly with this political leaders having that kind of mind frame and mindset? How do you think that this world can move on smoothly, as you have just mentioned regarding the trade?
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Sung. I think it's a very important question. There are other examples. You mentioned, China not importing coal from Australia. Also, I would add Russia is being very slow in delivering natural gas to Germany, so the price is going up. Saudi Arabia is unhappy with the United States, so Saudi Arabia is not increasing oil production. So unfortunately, it seems we have more and more examples. And, I think to be fair, we have to also say the US government, has increased export restrictions aimed at China, and that's falls into the same kind of category. So I don't have any easy answer for you. I would point out that China's experience with Australia is interesting because it didn't have much effect on the Australian economy. It actually had a big effect on the Chinese economy. And now they've started importing Australian coal again. So I do think there is a tendency in many situations for the economics to win out. But leaders, powerful countries are going to continue to use these political tools. And we can, I think a standard answer would be we could try to address this more through different types of trade agreements. But frankly, Australia and China are in a trade agreement. You have a free trade agreement with China. That doesn't seem to stop them. So I'm not sure we can discipline powerful countries with trade agreements, excuse me.
So we think we have to be prepared to have a rougher world trade situation.
Well, yes, but as I emphasized, the U.S.-China trade was going to hit a new record, but just for the whole world, global trade volumes are up about 10% from before the pandemic. And, a lot of the bottlenecks in the world is, there's so much trade going on. We don't have enough ships. We don't have enough containers. So there, overall, global trade seems to be holding up very well, but you're absolutely right. We can point to some specific cases, mostly involving authoritarian governments, frankly, which interfere with the smooth functioning of the system.
Thank you.
Yes, may I intervene? Chairman Song raised an extremely important issue here, because that has become the export restriction on the part of China of this very critical ingredient that we need in Korea. Korea depends upon some 90% of their demand.
Urea solution, yeah.
Yes, here. I think the message that perhaps we may like to share is a couple of things. One is, as Mr. Song said just before, and also David, you also alluded to, that is that international trading system needs to be managed toward more congenial, more smoother functioning, so that counterparts in global trade can all benefit. The other is perhaps the message to each country. In this not perfectly functioning global trade regime, I think every country has to prepare for themselves, reduce the risk of such disruptions, supply chain disruptions. So in case of Korea, for this particular item, I think the voice has been raised about the need for preemptive measures, for example, to diversify the sources of import of such critical item well in advance, rather than we react to this situation. I think we should have taken more proactive stance on this issue. So we all learn lessons from this case. And David, with your voice reaching out to U.S. Treasury and World WTO, perhaps raise your voice about further improving the global trading regime, so all the countries involved can benefit. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Chairman Song?
No, it's at this moment that I want to hand over my mind to you. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman Song, for taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, I would like to have a couple of more guests who can join us to raise a question. First, now I would like to connect to Dr. An Chung-young, whom you may know, is a distinguished professor at Chungang University and former president of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. He will join us. I'm sure he will raise a question about trade issues. His expertise in that area. Okay, Professor An.
Good evening, Dr. David Dollar. It's really a pleasure to see you online. Well, I really appreciate it very much for your highly analytic views on China's domestic economic situation and the trade. Since you touched upon the trade aspect, I would like to ask about the US membership issue on the CPTPP and your views on Korea's entry to the mega deal, and then changing trade landscape due to the expected effectuation of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in January next year. I was really perplexed by the fact that the former President Donald Trump, right after his inauguration, scrapped mercilessly the TPP, which had been, concluded laboriously by the Obama administration. But now, as you can see, China has applied officially for the CPTPP membership in the absence of the United States. And the UK and Taiwan also submitted the application. Korea will follow suit very soon. I thought the Biden administration would come back to CPTPP rather quickly after his inauguration to take the driver's seat to push for the enlarged and most advanced CPTPP, basically reviving the original high standard TPP and robust multilateralism, and even the highly needed the resilient supply chains. Against this backdrop, 3 questions I would like to pose. Number 1, some say that the Biden administration may not return during his presidency. Under this situation, the US is likely to be marginalized in Asia once the RCEP is put in force early next year. When do you think the US rejoins the CPTPP? Second, President Xi Jinping of China appears to be very serious to undertake a domestic reform to meet the high entry standard of CPTPP, including subsidy to SOEs, labor and environmental standard. How do you see any of the existing members of CPTPP, like Japan, Australia, or Canada, would veto on China's entry, even if the US is absent, or for the reason of China's non-market economy status? Finally, given the ongoing trade war between Japan and Korea, I really hope the US and Korea would join CPTPP together to revive the multilateralism and to revive a resilient supply chain system. What do you think about this possibility? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. An. I think you've raised some very important points. Let me take your third question first, okay? Because I think it leads into some of the others. So I'm a big believer in free trade. I think the Asia Pacific region will continue to be the engine of global growth and global trade. And I think there are still some military risks. Of course, North Korea, tension over China, Taiwan, mainland China, Taiwan. I don't think trade and economics automatically solve these issues, but I think trade and economics create a much better foundation for peace. So I definitely agree with you. The US and Korea should join hands and get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I hope that Korean leaders and other Asian leaders are frank with the US administration. The US administration talks about coordinating China policy with our allies, but I don't see them doing it. And so I hope that your leaders pass this kind of message to President Biden and his team that the US is missing from Asia Pacific trade agreements, and it's a big mistake. Now, take your first question. I don't think the instinct of this Biden team is to return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I thought that Biden would take a little time to review the situation, and then he would reverse President Trump's trade policy. But that has not happened. He has basically endorsed President Trump's trade policy, including staying out of the TPP and waging a trade war against China. And the evidence is pretty clear this is not good for the US economy. But unfortunately, trade has become kind of a dirty word in the United States. Ironically, when you take public opinion polls of ordinary people, there's very strong support for trade. But when you get to Washington politics, the interest groups that weigh in are mostly quite negative about international trade. And then on your second question, I think President Xi Jinping is very serious about joining Trans-Pacific Partnership. Because of the crackdown on these digital firms that I mentioned, like Ant Financial, there's this storyline in America that China is backing away from economic reform. And I don't think that's accurate. I think the leadership doesn't like the digital economy, but they like high-tech manufacturing, they like trade. And I think they are trying to discipline their state enterprises, create more of a level playing field between the private sector and state firms. So I think for President Xi's technical advisors, his policy people, for them joining TPP makes enormous sense to pursue a domestic reform agenda. And President Xi, apparently sees the wisdom of this. So I think it's a very interesting moment. I think it's a dangerous moment for the United States that it could get locked out of these agreements through its own domestic politics. And we talk about, confronting China and building a coalition of like-minded countries. But I don't see that our partners like South Korea, want to follow the Biden approach of confrontation with China. I think, we already discussed some difficult issues. I think no one's naive about China anymore. But the point is, for the economies already in TPP, there would be huge benefit to having China join. So, I think it'll be different among countries. It'll be tough for Japan. But if there's a pretty strong move around Asia, that this is good to get China into these agreements, then I could see Japan going along.
Well, I hope the Washington politics can exert revival of the multilateralism. Once the RCEP is put in force and China-centered supply system is likely to be even more, strengthened rather than, weakened.
Right.
If so, U.S. is very much likely to be marginalized from the Asian economic interdependence. I think in this regard, the U.S. should join as quickly as possible CPTPP to recover the lost credibility in the multilateral the philosophy, which U.S. has been championed since World War II.
I totally agree with you, Dr. Ahn.
Okay, thank you.
Especially from the perspective of a country like Korea, sitting in the East Asia corridor, if you like, and dealing with China, Japan, and other countries, and now in the middle of a sort of confrontation between US-led free market economy countries and in China and some.
Dr. Jung,
Yes.
can I ask one question to Dr. Dollar?
Please make it very quick because we have
Yes.
another person
Okay,
lined
yeah.
up now.
Okay, Dr. Dollar, maybe as you may know well, the U.S. Department of Commerce requested the Korean semiconductor manufacturers, Samsung and SK, to submit all the international transaction record, what price with whom, and even the inventory level. I thought this is really, is not in conformity with the market economic principle. Well, U.S. and Korea are, ally each other. We can trust each other. I think the U.S. Department of Commerce should respect a fundamental, privacy principles of business, management. What do you think about this?
I agree with you. I think privacy is a fundamental part of private property rights. So that, the U.S. has got quite a few different technology measures aimed at China, trade and investment. I think the U.S. has gone too far. And in particular, what I pay attention to is if we can't bring our allies like South Korea along, then these measures are not likely to be effective.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you, because we have to move on. So thank you very much, Dr. Ahn, for joining us. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Oh Young-jin. He's the president of the Korea Times, a leading English newspaper in Korea. Mr. Oh?
Thank you so much for kind introduction. And Dr. Dollar, it was a very interesting explanation about the China. China is global opportunity and potential pitfall, as we know. First, the question, it's I'm going to deviate from the subject of economy. Maybe the economy inherently embedded in my questions as well. My first question is, after hearing your explanation, I'm beginning to confirm my old belief, maybe my thought that the U.S. has decided to see China as a force to bring down. Most recently, we have seen U.S. President Biden criticize Xi Jinping, Chinese president, for not appearing at the COP26 meeting. And we have not seen many friendly gestures toward China by Biden, who was initially thought of as a globalist, but has been acting like more like a isolationist predecessor Trump. What do you think about my question about has U.S. decided to see the China as a force to bring down somebody you can negotiate with?
You certainly have that line of thinking, quite a bit in Washington, in both political parties. So you have some pretty hostile anti-China legislation developing in Congress. I would say the Biden team, you can point to statements from the Biden team where they say explicitly that we do not consider China an enemy, or we do not think the conflict with China is inevitable. So I think, to be fair to the Biden team, they have made some statements that are a little bit more conciliatory, but they've also made a lot of very hostile statements. And I know the Chinese take it very personally. We had that terrible meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, where our Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, lectured the Chinese in front of TV cameras. That's no way to do diplomacy, with the Chinese. So I know that there are more and more, intellectuals and policymakers in China who think the United States is going the direction, that you're talking about, because they hear certain statements and they see what Congress is doing. Plus, public opinion polls in the U.S. have turned very negative about China. And so I think it is somewhat of a dangerous situation. And the best, the most positive thing I can say is, that you do have these, fairly regular high-level statements, from people like Blinken and Jake Sullivan, that we do not consider China an enemy. So maybe this summit meeting between Xi and Biden will diffuse the tension, but the issues you raised, they're going to be lingering. They're not going to go away.
Related to that,
okay.
please. Related to that,
make it quick and short.
I'm going to make
we
it
have
very
only
quick.
a few minutes.
If China clamps up and goes inward, it would be disaster, considering economic heft it has to the rest of in the world. And if so, why don't we, as he said, don't we need to be more conciliatory toward China? And the world has lived with dictators of a global scale before. Why not with the Xi?
Right. My own view is, obviously we live in a very complicated world. We've got some very important authoritarian countries like China, but also Vietnam in your neighborhood. And then you've got Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia, the major suppliers of oil and gas in the world. So personally, I'm in favor of a multilateral system where, governments of all stripes, basically, both democratic and authoritarian governments, can play by the same rules in the economic sphere. And I think that, frankly, is the system we set up at the end of World War II. But now there's this tendency to try to create clubs of like-minded countries, clubs of democracy. Personally, I think it's a dangerous tendency, because if we don't have economic engagement with these authoritarian countries, there'll be much higher risk of war. Plus economics really is win-win. So it's a good place to start in terms of building your relations.
Thanks.
Okay, is that okay? Sorry to rush you.
But
No,
it's
no.
some other time. I will continue to ask more questions next time.
Okay, all right, thank you very much, because we are receiving some questions from our members and viewers through chatting room. So I was hoping to raise a few more questions with David before we let you go. But I'm now told that perhaps with your understanding and permission, extend our time for about 10 minutes. So I hope it's okay with you, not too late for you over there. Okay, now let me pursue this question a little bit more. That is about the slowing growth of China's economy. You did say that because of some headwinds, especially like property sector, which contributes a very significant portion of China's GDP, cleaning up that will take a few years at least. Not 8%, 6-7%. Perhaps they may be shooting for 5% or so over the medium term. And what's really important for us, for countries like Korea and Korean enterprises, to plan ahead for longer time horizon. How do you see the sustainable level of growth of Chinese economy from longer time horizons? There are different views about this. Some say that even there's some pessimistic view is coming on. That is that high growth days of China's economy is gone. Now it's now declining economy, in a way, declining power in the global scene. On the other hand, but still large market, great potential, and they will have very decent growth of the longer time horizon. What did you pick out of this? Two different views.
Right, I'll take one from column 1 and one from column 2, okay? By which I mean that, I definitely think China's growth rate has definitely slowed down even before the pandemic hit. The trend growth rate had declined, for quite a long time. It was up around 10%, and then it declined to around 8%, and more recently before the pandemic around 6%. So, that's clearly a fact. That's happening. And as I said, I think it'll trend down a little bit further, but I'm not pessimistic in the sense of, there are analysts who think it's going to go to 0. I don't see that as a possibility. But then on the second question you were raising, I don't see China having less economic power or influence in the world. If anything, I think it has more, because remember, it's a lot bigger. So, it was, when it was growing at 10%, its economy was less than $10 trillion. And so that's about maybe $800 billion of new GDP per year. Now it's going to be a $20 trillion economy very soon, right? So if that grows at 5%, that's $1 trillion a year. So I think the actual impact of China on partners in terms of different types of trade and investment, I think that's going to continue at a very high level.
Okay. Well, that's fair assessment, I think. But some may further say that there are some serious structural problems facing China. For example, rapid pace of aging. That will clearly undermine the growth model based on sufficient labor force. And more lately, international community, especially larger investors, are becoming very concerned about P risk in China. I mean political risk. Now, you did mention earlier the government's regulatory crackdown on big techs. Certainly, there's some justification for that, and other countries also do that to a certain extent to contain overexpansion of those companies into especially a monopoly of data. But a series of issues taking Chinese authorities, apparently led by Communist Party, will raise an issue about how the kind of dynamism, quite often coming from private sector, it's difficult to get it back if you look at the way the system works. So would you have say on this political risk aspect China poses, And also, if the growth is slowing down, where China will find or should find new sources of growth engine.
Okay, thank you. Great question. So on the new sources of growth, you're absolutely right that the demographics are quite negative for China. The labor force has basically peaked and is going to decline, and sort of labor force is not going to be a source of growth. They continue to have a high savings rate and investment rate, but they face some very sharply diminishing marginal returns to investment and capital. So the only thing left is innovation. And I think leaders understand that, and they're putting a lot of emphasis into college education, various fiscal support to research and development. They're generating a kind of a world-beating number of patents. So they have a lot of positives, but I do think this is where disciplining the state enterprises is important, because in general, state enterprises are not very innovative. There are only a few exceptions, and Chinese state enterprises are not particularly innovative. So they've been getting their dynamism from the private sector, and the crackdown on those digital firms, I think that's not going to help. But they still have a lot of, that's very focused on the digital economy. You've got a lot of manufacturing firms in China that are private. An interesting trend is multinational companies are moving more and more of their research to China. So again, despite the political tensions, foreign companies are investing in China at a high level. They're bringing more research effort into China. So, I think China does have the potential to become an innovative economy. But an issue we touched on, with a couple of your commentators is China has to remain open and continue to and become more open. So if China joins the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's a smart move for creating the kind of environment that generates innovation. If they don't, if they turn inward, then I wouldn't be optimistic about the Chinese economy at all.
All right, thank you. Perhaps one last question for you, although we can go and on with you for quite some time, but I should let you go to sleep. Okay, now this is continuing our discussion of sort of U.S.-China relation or tensions, if you like. Now, one of the most serious issues that we see from this part of the world is about the future of Taiwan. It's a very serious issue for us. And, you did mention that the scheduled virtual meeting between Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi next week likely to address is clarifying this kind of situation and hopefully give some comfortable the message to involved. But in your view, how real is this instability or possible military confrontation in that part of the world near Taiwan? And if there's a serious risk, then this is a tough question. How a country like Korea should respond to that very difficult situation?
Yeah, good. No.
Sorry to put you in a difficult spot.
No, it's a good question. I think a lot of people do not understand that the U.S. has had a consistent policy on this for about 50 years now, right? So Taiwan has not declared independence. The U.S. does not have any official recognition of Taiwan. We recognize the People's Republic of China, and we have a position that any resolution of the Taiwan situation should be peaceful and should be mutually agreeable to the mainland and to Taiwan. And I think, unfortunately, in the last couple of years, while the US we keep saying that that's still our policy, and just in the last week, Jake Sullivan was on CNN saying that there's been no change in our Taiwan policy, but the US has been kind of chipping away. Like, it's just been revealed that there are US military advisors, on the ground in Taiwan, for example. That's something that's just happened in the last few years. We've had, higher level visits, cabinet officials going to Taiwan. So it's reasonable for the mainland to be worried that the US is slowly changing its policy. And I think in the extreme, if Taiwan declared independence, I do think the mainland would respond militarily. But as long as Taiwan does not declare independence, I don't think it's very likely. I don't think it's at all likely that the mainland's going to attack Taiwan, because it would be a disaster for the whole East Asia economy, frankly, and it would set back all their economic and environmental objectives. So to me, the risk is the US encroaching on this kind of diplomatic space, but then also the risk of a mistake, because you do have Chinese jets flying. They don't fly into Taiwan airspace, but they fly into, Taiwan has a self-identified, air defense, what do they call it? Air defense identification zone, where, you expect planes to fly in there to identify themselves. Anyway, there's a lot of planes in the air in and around Taiwan. And if there were some kind of accident where somebody were killed, I think, that's the kind of accident that could lead to escalation that nobody wants. So it's definitely something to worry about. And I hope the two presidents can have a frank discussion about this when they meet next week, because, as I said, the US keeps repeating that our official policy hasn't changed. It's what was set up coming out of those first visits by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger to Beijing starting in 1972. So we've had the same policy for 50 years.
How about the hypothetical question that are raised?
Well,
if something happened, how Korea
I
should respond?
can't tell you what to do, but I can make a prediction. My prediction is, if there's war over Taiwan, it means a lot more to mainland China than it does to any of the other outside players. So I would expect, even if somehow the US could respond militarily and that somehow went well to start, the mainland would never give up. So I don't think you could ever, I don't think the US and its allies could ever truly win a war over Taiwan. And that's one reason why our policy makes sense, that we want peaceful resolution. It's in China's interest too, because if China takes over Taiwan militarily, that's going to be a terrible situation. That's not going to be a productive economy. So I think we have to appeal to common interest. But frankly, if there is a war, I don't see that outside forces can prevent mainland China from taking over Taiwan.
Okay. Of course, as you said, that kind of disastrous situation is something that we should avoid through diplomatic means and for the common prosperity, if you like, in this part of and globally. Okay, all right. Thank you very much, David. Pleasure seeing you this in many years, and hope to see you in person hopefully by next year, if we have a freer traveling guidelines by that time. So till then, stay safe and healthy. And thank you very much on behalf of our members and viewers. Once again, appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the discussion very much, and great to see Korean friends, even just virtually and hopefully in person before long.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.